All right, today we're tackling one of the most brutal and honestly most consequential figures of the 20th century, Joseph Stalin. We're going to break down the systems he created, the terror he unleashed, and the really complicated legacy he left behind. So, let's get right into it.
Let's start with a quote from the man himself. This gives you a chilling insight into his worldview. It sets the stage for the almost unimaginable scale of what we're about to talk about. This isn't just a clever phrase. It's a mindset that can justify almost anything. It's a lens we really have to look through to understand his entire regime. And that really brings us to the big question for today, something historians still argue about. Was Stalin just a product of his time, a result of all that violence and chaos? Or was he the one who actually architected the horror that was to come? Let's take a look at the evidence.
To get Stalin, you first have to get the world he came from. We're talking about post-revolutionary Russia. It was pure chaos. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin, had taken over, but the country was completely broken. And it's in this power vacuum that Stalin starts his slow, methodical climb to the top.
So what's fascinating here is how he did it. In 1922, he gets this job, General Secretary. It sounds kind of boring, right? A bureaucratic role. But he turned it into the ultimate weapon. See, as General Secretary, he controlled all the party appointments. He could put his own loyal people in every position. So when Lenin dies in 1924, his rivals, guys like Trotsky, are out there having big public debates. Meanwhile, Stalin is quietly in the background, building his power base. By 1929, it was too late for anyone else. The game was over. He had completely outmaneuvered them all.
Okay, so he's got the power. But how did he keep it? Well, he didn't just rule with an iron fist, he built an entire system, an architecture of control. Let's break down the key pillars of that system.
First up, collectivization. This was a massive, radical move. The government literally seized millions of private farms from peasants. This ended centuries of tradition. The idea was to modernize farming and, more importantly, give the state total control over the food supply. And as you can imagine, control over food is a huge source of power.
Now, to make a policy like that work, you needed an enemy. And the regime created one, the kulaks. Officially, this meant wealthier peasants. But in practice, the label could be slapped on anyone who resisted. They were painted as enemies of the people, which gave this state the justification to arrest them, exile them, or just kill them. It was a way to break the will of anyone who stood in the way. An entire social class was basically wiped out.
And where did so many of these enemies end up? In the Gulag. And it's so important to understand. This wasn't just a prison system. It was a huge network of brutal forced labor camps, and its main purpose was political. The Gulag was a tool designed to spread fear throughout the population, to keep everyone in line, and, on top of that, to provide free slave labor for Stalin's big industrial projects.
The scale is just mind-boggling. Let this number sink in. 14 million people. That's how many are estimated to have gone through the gulags in just a single 10-year period. It just shows how absolutely central this system of terror was. To put that in perspective, that's more people than were imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps over their entire existence. It was a continent-wide network of misery.
Then, between 1936 and 1938, Stalin's paranoia just went into overdrive. This period is known as the Great Purge or the Great Terror. He turned on his own Communist Party, trying to wipe out anyone he even remotely saw as a threat, past, present, or future.
And this just shows how systematic the whole thing was. This wasn't random violence. It was a terrifyingly efficient process. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, would arrest you, usually in the middle of the night. You'd be tortured until you gave a forced confession. That confession would then be used in a public show trial to make it all look legitimate. And then came the sentence, execution or the Gulag. Nobody was safe.
The Purge just gutted every part of Soviet society, including the military. I mean, just look at these numbers. Stalin killed almost all of his top military leaders because he was convinced they were plotting against him. It was pure paranoia. And this act left the Red Army catastrophically unprepared for the German invasion that was coming just a few years later.
And the control wasn't just physical, it was historical. This is wild. After an enemy was executed, Stalin had them literally erased from official photos, airbrushed right out of history. Think about that.
That's the ultimate power, not just to kill someone, but to pretend they never even existed. So all these systems of terror, the purges, the gulags, the war against the peasants, they weren't just abstract policies. They had a devastating, real-world price. Let's try to get a handle on the total human cost of Stalin's rule. Now, these are all estimates, of course, and we may never know the true toll, but they give us a sense of the staggering consequences.
So first, let's talk about direct executions. At the peak of the Great Purge, in just 2 years, an estimated 750,000 people were killed by the state. These weren't war casualties. This was political murder, with quotas for executions handed down from the very top. It was systematic, industrial-scale killing.
Beyond the executions, you have the deaths inside the gulags themselves. At least another 1.5 million people died in the camps. And these weren't quick deaths from a firing squad. These were slow, awful deaths from being worked to exhaustion or from starvation and disease in just horrific, inhuman conditions. And finally, we get to what might be the single greatest human cost of Stalin's rule. Forcing collectivization didn't just break the spirit of the peasantry, it broke the entire food supply. The state took grain from the very people who grew it, and it led to a massive famine, especially in Ukraine, an event known as the Holodomor. Instead of helping, Stalin's regime actually used the famine as a weapon, making sure food shortages hit areas of resistance the hardest. Some historians estimate that as many as 14.5 million people starved to death as a direct result. So after hearing all of that, you'd think Stalin's legacy would be pretty clear-cut, right? But the reality, especially inside Russia today, is, well, it's surprisingly complicated. Let's dig into why that is.
Here's the core of the contradiction. On the one hand, he's a mass murderer, responsible for the deaths of millions of his own people. But on the other hand, he's the leader who defeated Nazi Germany in World War II and turned the Soviet Union into a global superpower. And for a lot of people, that victory is so huge that it overshadows everything else.
And this isn't just an old debate. It's happening right now. Take a look at this poll from 2019. It's actually shocking. It shows that a majority of Russians surveyed had a positive or neutral view of Stalin. This tells you just how powerful that narrative of Stalin, the strong leader, the victor, really is. A narrative that often pushes the memory of his millions of victims to the side.
Now, this is a really fascinating final point. It shows how his influence continued even after he was gone. After World War II, when the UN was creating the legal definition for genocide, early drafts included targeting political and social groups. But the Soviet delegation fought hard to have that removed. Why? Well, because a definition that included wiping out class enemies like the kulaks or political opponents would have been a perfect description of Stalin's entire regime.
And that leaves us with this really profound final question. If the definition of genocide hadn't been changed, partly at the insistence of Stalin's own government, would his actions, the destruction of the kulaks, the political purges, the man-made famine, be legally classified as genocide today? It's a question that really forces us to think about not just what happened, but how we define history's worst crimes.